Words have a way of wrapping around us. They don't just carry meaning, they carry emotion, energy, intention. Some feel like relief. Others whisper sweet nothings into our ears, offering comfort in the middle of our chaos. And when life is noisy, rushed, and lonely, it's easy to fall for the kind of language that feels like a warm blanket. But that's where the trap begins, because the most dangerous kind of manipulation doesn't scream. It doesn't show its teeth, it speaks softly, it smiles. It knows exactly what you want to hear and then gives you just enough of it to make you lower your guard. That's the quiet power of language, not when it informs, but when it controls. We live in a world where those who speak beautifully are often assumed to be right, where those who express themselves with elegance and flair are given more credibility than those who speak plainly, even if they speak truth. And the more often a message is repeated with confidence, the more we believe it, even if it's a lie. Why? Because we're human, we all carry wounds, disappointments, longings. And when we hear words that sound like hope, we don't always question the intent behind them. We let them in like visitors we want to believe in. But here's the thing, beautiful words can act like bandages. They cover the pain, but they don't heal it. On the surface, everything looks fine. Underneath, the infection spreads. Words, when they aren't backed by action, can become weapons. Not loud, aggressive weapons, quiet ones. Ones that lull you to sleep while they reshape your thoughts. That's the genius of propaganda. It doesn't need to scream when it can serenade. And few stories show this better than George Orwell's Animal Farm. At first glance, it's a simple story. Animals rise up against their human oppressors, hoping to create a new society built on justice, equality, and freedom. They believe in a dream, in a new beginning. And under the leadership of the pigs, they expect that dream to come true. But that's not what happens. Slowly, the pigs begin to twist language. At first, it's harmless, catchy phrases, slogans, things that sound good. But over time, those words stop serving truth and start serving power. And here's what's chilling. The problem isn't the words themselves, it's how they're used. Because when the power of speech is concentrated in the hands of the few, it stops being a means of expression. It becomes a tool of control. Domination doesn't arrive with tanks and guns. It arrives with dreams, with promises, with beautifully crafted speeches about a better future. And when a group of people or animals is tired, overworked, and desperate, those promises become everything. That's the danger of utopia, because who wants to be the one to question hope? Who wants to look ungrateful or selfish for challenging a beautiful idea? In Animal Farm, the pigs aren't just offering a political structure, they're selling a feeling, a sense of belonging, a chance to start over. And that emotional hook is what makes the manipulation work. The pigs don't need to force the animals to believe. They just need to inspire them. And when you inspire someone deeply enough, you don't need to convince them anymore. They'll convince themselves. At first, the pigs' language is poetic, uplifting. It touches the heart. But that's exactly why it's dangerous. Because real manipulation doesn't start with fear, it starts with love, with connection, with the illusion of unity. And the moment you feel you're part of something grand, something for the greater good, you stop asking questions. You stop noticing the cracks. You stop listening to your gut. That's how it works. Charming words pose as truth. Emotion disables critical thought, and before you know it, obedience isn't forced, it's volunteered. And this is why slogans are so effective. Take the famous one from the book, "All animals are equal." Simple, elegant, easy to remember. Too beautiful to question, but the simplicity doesn't bring clarity, it brings submission. It creates a kind of sacred phrase, something that sounds so good, so morally right, that you feel guilty even thinking critically about it. And when a sentence like that is repeated again and again, with conviction, with confidence, it doesn't just become familiar, it becomes reality. That's the power of repetition. You don't need to explain a lie if you can make it feel like a truth, and repetition wears people down. Just like water carves rock over time, constant exposure to the same message breaks down resistance. In the story, the pigs start painting slogans on the barn walls. They're short, absolute, declarative, and that's all it takes. Because when a phrase is everywhere in conversations, in dreams, in daily habits, it becomes a lens. You don't see the world as it is, you see it through the slogan, and nuance disappears. Even when it's obvious that the pigs are living in luxury while the other animals suffer, no one speaks up. Why would they? They don't want to seem ungrateful, they don't want to be that one. This is how language turns into a cage, a golden one, polished, pretty, but still a cage. The beauty of the phrase masks the ugliness of the reality. The animals don't rebel, not because they don't notice, but because they've been trained not to question what sounds nice. And that's how you know manipulation has taken hold, not when people are silent out of fear, but when they're silent out of belief. When they obey not because they have to, but because they want to, because they think it's good, because they think it's right. That's why regimes don't just censor, they rewrite, not just laws, but memories. In Animal Farm, the commandments of the revolution begin to shift, little by little. A never becomes a sometimes, an all becomes a some. It's barely noticeable, but it changes everything, and the animals, they're too tired. Too overworked, too confused to remember what used to be true. This is one of authoritarianism's most dangerous tools, not the erasure of memory, but the slow emptying of it. The past becomes vague, malleable. A story owned by those in power. Anyone who dares to remember becomes a problem, a threat, a traitor, and that's when truth becomes elastic. Rewritten history becomes not just accepted, but revered. It's beautiful, it's noble, it's patriotic. And nobody wants to be the one who ruins that failing. When the truth becomes inconvenient, the powerful don't destroy it, they rewrite it. It's subtle at first, a word changed here, a sentence revised there. Over time, the past becomes unrecognizable, not because it's forgotten, but because it's been edited into something easier to digest, something that benefits the storyteller. And in Orwell's Animal Farm, that's exactly what happens. The commandments, the original values of the revolution, slowly begin to shift, not all at once, not obviously, just enough to change the meaning. And the animals, exhausted from labor and emotionally drained, don't have the strength to question what they vaguely remember. They just keep working. That's the genius of authoritarian control. It doesn't require erasing memory completely. It just needs to confuse it, to bury it under new narratives, to overwhelm it with contradictions, to make people unsure of what they know so they stop trusting their own minds. And that's when fear begins to creep in. Not the loud kind of fear, not the kind that sends you running. It's quieter, a glance that lingers too long, a conversation that cuts off too soon. Someone disappears, and when they come back, they're not quite the same. They're quieter, distant. Hollow, it's not explained, it's just understood. In Animal Farm, Napoleon, the pig who rises to absolute power, never has to justify anything. He doesn't argue, he doesn't reason, he doesn't need to. His presence alone is enough. Disagreement becomes betrayal, questioning becomes danger, and those who speak up vanish. Propaganda becomes a second language, one that everyone learns, even if they don't believe in it. Squealer, the regime's mouthpiece, is a master at twisting truth into something palatable. He doesn't deny the cruelty, he rebrands it, he calls it necessity. Loyalty, sacrifice, and the animals, they don't cheer because they understand. They cheer because they're afraid not to. That's the power of symbolic terror. You don't need constant violence when you've trained everyone to self-police, when just the possibility of punishment is enough to keep everyone in line. Fear, when it's internalized, becomes its own prison, and over time, morality itself begins to bend. It's not just the facts that change, it's the meaning of right and wrong. Words like duty, loyalty, and sacrifice become tools of obedience. Affection becomes submission. Conscience becomes compliance. Language becomes a distorted mirror. You still recognize your reflection, but something is off. You're not sure what, but it makes you uneasy. That's the point. The new system doesn't need you to love it, it just needs you to stop questioning it. And it's not just about silencing dissent, it's about redefining it. Turning rebellion into selfishness, turning resistance into treason, changing the names until no one remembers what anything really meant in the first place. In Animal Farm, calling someone a traitor is enough to justify their execution. No evidence needed, just the word, that's all, because by then the animals have learned not to ask for proof. They've learned to trust the slogans, not their eyes, to obey the narrative, not the reality. It's chilling because we've seen it happen. Not just in stories, in history, in real life. Authoritarian systems don't always look like dictatorships. Sometimes they look like order, like efficiency, like a promise of safety, and that's what makes them dangerous. Because once fear dresses up as protection, once power starts speaking in soft tones, we stop noticing the harm. The injustice becomes familiar, the cruelty becomes routine, and over time we stop reacting, we stop caring. And that's when control becomes complete. It no longer needs to be enforced from the outside, it lives in us, in our choices, in our silences, in the way we talk to ourselves. This emotional surrender is the final frontier of domination. In the book, no one represents this better than Boxer, the loyal horse. He's not a villain, he's not corrupt, he's kind, dedicated, pure-hearted. His motto, "I will work harder," becomes a mantra, a prayer. A shield against the discomfort he doesn't want to face, but his good intentions make him blind. He doesn't see how he's being used. He doesn't realize that no amount of effort will ever be enough. That the system isn't broken, it's built that way. He trusts, even when the truth is right in front of him. And in the end, when he breaks down, when he's no longer useful, they discard him like a worn-out tool. This is the darkest trick of manipulation. It uses good people as its strongest pillars, not the greedy, not the power-hungry, the loyal, because the loyal don't question, they don't hesitate, they don't think twice, they believe. And when loyalty is paired with naivety, it becomes one of the most powerful weapons in any regime's arsenal. You don't need to bribe people when they think they're doing the right thing. You just need to give them a noble-sounding cause. The more they believe in it, the more they'll defend it, even against themselves. That's why systems of control don't just teach obedience. They make it look like virtue, like nobility, like sacrifice. And that's how the innocent become the enforcers, not out of malice, not even out of fear, but out of love, love for an ideal, love for a dream, love for something that no longer exists if it ever did. In Animal Farm, it's the loyal animals who repeat the slogans, who silence the doubters, who shame those who dare to ask questions, not because they're evil, but because they're trying to hold on to something good. But the system doesn't care about their sincerity, it just uses it, and it only needs a few, because you don't need everyone to believe, you just need enough people to comply, to keep the machine running, to keep the illusion alive. And the more those people believe they're doing good, the stronger the system becomes. That's the paradox. Authoritarian regimes don't survive through violence alone. They survive through devotion. They survive on the backs of those who can't see what's behind the curtain and never think to look. And when that devotion meets fear, something even more dangerous is born, a craving for order. A hunger for anyone to take control, even if that means giving up freedom, especially when things feel uncertain. That's when the voice of authority starts to sound like salvation. And suddenly freedom, the very thing we once fought for, begins to feel inconvenient, complicated, risky, chaotic, and the idea of a strong leader, it starts to feel comforting. That's how it happens, not with violence, with relief. When chaos becomes unbearable, peace, any kind of peace, starts to feel like a blessing. That's the moment when the most dangerous compromises are made, not in anger, not in fear. But in fatigue, people don't always give up their freedom because they're forced to. Sometimes they surrender it just to rest, just to stop the noise, just to let someone else decide. and that's exactly what happens in Animal Farm. After the revolution, the animals start with high hopes. They gather for meetings, they vote, they discuss. But over time, those gatherings grow less frequent, the debates become harder, the responsibilities heavier, decision-making is tiring. So when Napoleon, the authoritarian pig, begins to suggest that maybe it's better if he just handles things, for now, just temporarily, most of the animals agree. Relieved even, they're too tired to argue. That's the turning point, when freedom stops feeling like a gift and starts feeling like a burden. And the language used to justify that shift. It's always the same, it's for your safety. It's only temporary, it's for the good of all. Soft words, gentle promises, no alarms, but what begins as an exception quickly becomes the rule. The temporary leader becomes permanent, the shared responsibilities disappear. And soon freedom is framed as a threat, something dangerous, even selfish. And those who dare to speak up, they're labeled disloyal, ungrateful, problematic, and no one wants to be that, especially when everyone else seems fine. Especially when questioning means standing alone. That's how obedience grows, not through pressure, through relief. When life feels overwhelming, someone offering certainty, even if it costs you everything, can sound like a savior. The system doesn't grow strong because it crushes resistance. It grows strong because it offers rest. It's a twisted kind of hospitality, a seductive trade. Let go of the burden of thinking and we'll give you peace. And that's why people stay silent, not just out of fear, but out of weariness. The revolution, which once felt like hope, turns into theater, a performance, a ritual. The slogans are still painted on the walls. The speeches still mention justice and equality, but the meaning is gone. Now it's just noise. And in that noise, the pigs begin to change. They start sleeping in beds, trading with humans, walking on two legs. Everything they once condemned, they now imitate. Everything they swore to destroy, they now embrace. And yet the system marches on. Why? Because no one wants to believe it was all for nothing. Because admitting the truth would mean facing betrayal, not just by the leaders, but by themselves, their own hopes, their own loyalty. It's easier to keep pretending, to repeat the slogans, to smile through the contradictions, to ignore the discomfort in their gut, because the alternative, waking up, is terrifying. That's the cruel genius of authoritarian power. It doesn't need to erase the revolution. It just needs to absorb it, to mimic it. To put it on display dressed in new clothes so that people can keep believing they're still part of something noble. But it's hollow. The same systems of control remain, the same exploitation, the same hierarchy. Only now it's wrapped in new language, words that sound progressive, symbols that suggest change, but nothing changes, only the names, and this is where language becomes its most dangerous. Because when people start confusing sounding good with being good, injustice slips by unnoticed. In Animal Farm, Squealer, the pig in charge of propaganda, doesn't deny what's happening, he just reframes it. He makes it sound noble, he makes it sound necessary. He doesn't lie directly, he decorates, he gives cruelty a logic, he makes betrayal sound like duty. He wraps injustice in velvet, and the animals, too tired and too trusting, accept it. That's how manipulation survives, not by hiding but by beautifying. Punishment becomes discipline, betrayal becomes protection. Inequality becomes strategy. It's all just rebranded, made palatable, and the result, a numb kind of existence, where the animals no longer believe but still obey, where tragedy doesn't disappear, it just loses its name. Because the speeches are so polished, the explanations so reasonable, the rituals so elegant, and so people stop reacting. Hunger, it's a production adjustment. Silencing dissent, that's peacekeeping. Repression, that's public safety. Everything is renamed, everything is softened, everything is explained away. And anyone who questions it, anyone who says, wait, this isn't right, they're labeled the problem. Too sensitive, too emotional, too negative. And so they're dismissed. The system teaches people to smile at what should make them furious. to accept what should never have been acceptable. And the scary part is it works. Even laughter changes. It's no longer real joy. It's a coping mechanism, a shield, a way of pretending everything is okay when it's clearly not. Because deep down, something doesn't sit right. There's always that feeling, that itch, that quiet voice that says something's off. Even if you can't explain it, that's the first sign that the silence is cracking. That passivity isn't as complete as it looks. Because even when everything seems calm beneath the surface, unrest begins to hum. Not everyone has given up. Not everyone has forgotten. Somewhere inside, the discomfort is growing, hunger, fear, a vague sadness that language can't fully cover anymore. It starts as a whisper, but it grows, and this is where passivity reveals its true form. Not as weakness, but as self-defense, as a last-ditch effort to survive in a world that demands too much and gives too little. The animals in Animal Farm keep working, keep obeying, but their eyes become vacant, their spirits dim. They're not loyal anymore, they're numb. They've been defeated, not just physically, but emotionally. They no longer ask, is this right? They ask, is it even worth questioning anymore? That's how deep the manipulation runs. It doesn't just control your actions, it rewires your desires. It convinces you that surrender is sanity. And once you reach that point, the system doesn't need to justify itself anymore. It just continues. No resistance. No outrage, just routine. That's when oppression becomes invisible. It no longer comes from the outside, it lives inside the people, inside their silence, inside their resigned smiles. The fire of rebellion is gone. But even so, sometimes in the quietest moments something stirs. Not a shout, not a riot, just a thought, a memory, a feeling, and that's all it takes. Because even the smallest ember can reignite if the wind shifts just enough. Real change doesn't always begin with a bang. Sometimes it begins in silence. Not an empty silence, but a silence that listens, that pauses. That creates space for something real to come through. That's how the first cracks appear. Not through violence, not through protest, but through the quiet refusal to keep pretending. In Animal Farm, there's no dramatic turning point. No glorious uprising, just a shift, subtle signs, doubts shared in glances, questions that don't quite fit the narrative, hesitations that grow heavier with each passing day. This is how resistance truly begins, not with fists raised, but with hearts that stop nodding along. And it takes courage, not the courage to fight, but the courage to feel again, to stop numbing, to let the unease rise up and whisper. This isn't right, to see the lie without the comfort of habit, to realize that the carefully arranged world, the world built on polished slogans and sweet-sounding control, was always just a stage. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That moment of clarity is already a rebellion. Because when awareness enters, even in the smallest way, freedom begins to take root quietly but firmly. It's not about overthrowing anything. Not yet. It's about waking up, about noticing, about remembering that you once believed in something real, something that didn't need to be shouted to be true. And that memory, that feeling, that's where the real revolution starts, not outside. Inside, in the space between who you've been told to be and who you actually are. This kind of transformation doesn't arrive in speeches. It arrives in silence, in stillness, in the decision to stop performing and just be. It's the moment when slogans lose their magic, when rehearsed phrases start to feel empty, when you can no longer recite what you don't believe. And when that happens, even if you're still trapped, you've already begun to break free. Because now you're no longer running from yourself, you're turning inward with honesty, with gentleness, with patience. And from that return to yourself, something sacred is born. A kind of freedom that no one gave you because it was always yours. The kind that doesn't need approval, that doesn't need applause, that doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. This is the kind of presence that changes everything, not through dominance, but through authenticity. It's a freedom that says, I don't need to win, I don't need to be perfect, I just need to be honest. And once you taste that kind of truth, everything else feels fake. The pressure to prove, to achieve, to keep up, it fades. The need to be strong all the time, to always be right, it softens. And for the first time, you feel human again. Fully human, not a role, not a tool, not a function, a person with doubts, with flaws, with stories that don't need fixing, only understanding. And in that space, something else shifts, your connection with others deepens. Not because you have more to say, but because you no longer need to perform. Conversations stop being battles for validation. They become places to rest. You no longer seek to impress, just to connect. Affection becomes refuge, not reward, and in that kind of presence, trust returns. The world begins to feel a little less sharp, a little more honest, and you start to laugh again, not because everything is okay, but because laughter, real laughter, is what happens when the mask drops, when you can finally smile at your own absurdity, your clumsiness, your old mistakes, not out of shame, but out of survival, because you made it through the fog. You saw the lie and you chose something better. Laughter in that moment isn't denial, it's proof that you're still here, still feeling, still alive, and that's freedom, not the kind written in slogans. The kind that comes when you stop needing to be anything but yourself. And when you move from that place, from that stillness, your entire rhythm changes. You slow down, not because you're lazy, but because you're finally living. Time stops being something to manage, it becomes something to inhabit. You listen more, you notice the details, you make space for choice, real choice, not the kind forced by fear or habit. You say no more often. Not out of rebellion, out of clarity, because now you know what matters, what nourishes, what lasts, and what falls away, the noise, the pressure, the performative urgency, what remains, the essential. And here's the thing about the essential, it's quiet. It doesn't show off, it doesn't demand attention, but it's what holds everything together. The small gestures, the honest silences, the unspoken care, that's what freedom really looks like, not headlines, not heroes. But people awake in their own lives, grounded in their own truth. That's where dignity is born, not from being right, but from being real. And when you live from that place, language changes too. It stops being a shield. It becomes a bridge. You don't need to argue your worth. You don't need to sell your soul to be heard. You just speak sincerely, simply, like someone who no longer needs to pretend. And that's when words return to what they were meant to be, not tools of control, but expressions of presence. When we say only what we mean, when we mean only what we feel, that's when we begin to heal. Because healing isn't just about being pain-free, it's about being seen by others and by yourself. And that journey, it doesn't require a stage, it doesn't need a revolution, it just needs one person willing to stop pretending. To feel, to slow down, to see through the fog of sweetened control and say, no, I want something real, that's all it takes. And maybe that's the real revolution, not the kind that changes the world overnight, but the kind that changes how you exist inside it. How you treat yourself, how you treat others, how you listen, how you live. Because in the end, Animal Farm isn't just a warning about political power, it's a mirror. A reflection of what happens when we stop thinking for ourselves. When we trade freedom for comfort, when we fall in love with the sound of pretty lies and forget the weight of real truth. But it also offers hope, because no matter how deep the manipulation, how long the silence, how thick the fog, there is always a moment when someone wakes up. And in that moment, in that awakening, there's a spark. It doesn't roar, it doesn't demand, it just burns quietly, steadily. And if you feed it with honesty, with connection, with courage, it grows. Until one day, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not for everyone, but for you, that spark becomes a fire. And that fire, that's the beginning of something real. Not just freedom from others, freedom from the need to keep sleeping. Freedom to be awake in your own life, fully, finally, unapologetically.